Mood Indigo.
Hi, this is Carl Weintrack with the Daily Music Break at www.dailymusicbreak.com. Welcome to our inaugural video chat, and we're talking with Jeff Claassen. Jeff is an associate professor of harmony at Berklee College of Music in Boston. We're going to speak today about Duke Ellington, but before we get to that, I'd like to say that Jeff has performed with Bob Brookmeyer, Paquito de Rivera, George Russell, Gunther Schuller, Artie Shaw, I'm sure plenty of other great people, but these are some of the highest names that he's performed with. So first of all, Jeff, welcome and thank you very, very much for taking time out.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Carl. I really appreciate it. Look forward to talking with you today.
Well, thank you very much. To start with, in looking over your page at the website at Berklee, you're both a performer and teacher of music, actual technical music. You teach people how to play. You teach people, all of the technical elements, and you get into some of the cultural elements as well. First of all, is that rare? Do a lot of professors and associate professors do that, or is that something that's kind of unique? And how does that relate maybe to Duke Ellington?
Well, I don't know the rarity of it, but I do like to teach in a number of departments across the college because I believe as a musician that's an important part of what I do and how I perceive and what my perspective is in the music that I play. I like teaching students and discussing with students the ideas of being a creative individual, having some insight into what it is that you're performing, who you're playing with. I think understanding some of the history along the way is important, while at the same time understanding the rules that come along with it in terms of, and I actually hesitate using rules. I'll say, how do we hear things? How do we create and express based upon a common practice tradition? But I like it all. I think a performer should also be naturally a composer, a creator, an improviser, a conductor. Mm-hmm. Almost a philosopher sometimes as well, to be able to get discussions and be able to get real, creative, creative brainstorms going with their other fellow musicians.
So it's not just the music. It's not just knowing which notes to play at a particular point in time.
No.
Mm-hmm. And this seems like it would work in well with the discussion of Duke Ellington, because Duke Ellington is important historically, and I'm sure laid the groundwork for a lot of, just like Einstein laid the groundwork for a lot of things that people, scientists study today. How does Duke play into what you just said?
Well, considering I'll approach students like this. I mean, I'll say, so imagine a musician that you enjoy playing with, that understands you. And how long have you played with them? And students at the college level might have, 2 to 3 years. It's rare if you can get 5 years. There's a bassist I play with, and we're best friends. But when I tell them that Ellington ran a band for 50 years, they have to consider this idea of what does that mean? And it's more than just understanding someone's musical identity, but it's understanding, first off, how do you run a band? How do you deal with all the personalities? How do you deal with respecting your musicians so they respect you and want to play for you? How do you treat them well and pay them well? And I see over the 50 years that this is something that Ellington was able to do when other band leaders had to close or break up the band or have a smaller band. And this was something that he was able to do for a long period of time, not just looking and adapting to how he could be maybe considered more relevant in certain eras of the music, basically a jazz history through, Ellington's life, but how he could keep his band working. And that's huge. And that takes a lot of, that sort of understanding what's going on with the fellow musicians, understanding what's going on with the time.
Mm-hmm.
There were even moments where I know they were working, he had the band working, doing ice skating shows, or where he was doing, he was doing a little short feature. I think it was Universal, was it? Where he was with an animated stop motion puppet, like Puppetoons, the Puppet Pal guy that used to do those old Saturday morning shows. But he really did a lot of stuff to keep the band working, trying to consider different audiences, different types of people that might find what the band was doing interesting.
So and I'm diverging from the questions I have, which is always not a good idea, but it was different from Louis Armstrong, who's, when you talk about the giants of that era, that's probably the list at the very top. Other people came later, but Louis more or less gave his career over to Joe Glazer, and he just went and played. So that's I guess a key differentiation between the two.
Well, and yes, perhaps I do think that for both Louis Armstrong and Duke Ellington, I do think that the public perception and audience viewing and just in American music, they're icons, and I think that was for quite a bit this unblemished image of something that really stood for for greatness and quality. And I think that's something that definitely Duke Ellington and Louis Armstrong had in mind. But definitely Duke went through a variety of, started with Irving Mills and went to the Morris Agency and ended up, going through different labels and record companies and trying to figure out and navigate leading a band for so long.
To get back to my list of questions, and I tricked you because I told you questions I was going to ask, and when I always do that.
No, that was great.
What to a non-musician, and maybe someone younger today, everybody's heard the name Duke Ellington. What to you though is the essence of why Duke Ellington is important today? Why is he a giant?
I think this is a kind of a loaded question. A lot of ways to go with this. I think Ellington really understood the idea of collaboration, and by collaborating and involving himself with so many musicians, he was able to really tap into music in a way, especially with so many musicians on stage together, in a way that really people hadn't heard before, in a way that was able to change and able to take the personalities of the band and sort of evolve over time as music changed and people's perceptions of concerts and TV and movies and film changed. I think the collaborative efforts were huge for him. I think this is something that always kept him changing and being honest to the era in which he was living, versus being very stuck in an old school sound or a very traditional big band flavor.
What I hear you saying, please correct me if I'm wrong, is fascinating in that he was a genius at handling his band and keeping the band, keeping all these creative geniuses he worked with, satisfied enough that they stayed with the band. And also at the same time, he was almost helping to architect music going forward, jazz going forward, and how it fit into society, and it almost like a combination of the two. That he was almost like a presence in a sense.
Yeah, I think so. And it's and you said it best. Having the guys stay in the band because they wanted to. A number of them did leave and came back.
Right.
Johnny Hodges left for a few years and decided it was it's a lot to it. And he came back. Cootie Williams left, came back. A lot of members, kind of even some of the stars at one point left and came back. There were times when musicians who thought in the collaborative process that Duke Ellington owed them some money. Johnny Hodges might do this, like the money sign when they play a song, like, hey, this is my idea, and he was known for this.
Right.
And Clark Terry, in an interview, was quoted as saying that Clark Terry acknowledged this, that Ellington, had took these ideas from Barney Bigard and Cootie Williams or Johnny Hodges. And Clark Terry goes on to say, yeah, but these guys would have never made it into what Ellington made it into. It would have just been their warm-up exercise or a little melody that they played. So in that sense, yes, the collaborative effort was brilliant. And it was that, I think it has that idea of, if you want to use the, genius, I wouldn't disagree with you. I think it's difficult.
And who was just if you could briefly say who Johnny Hodges was and how important he was in this whole landscape of Duke Ellington.
Oh, and first off, he was the highest paid musician in the band.
Mm-hmm.
He was actually a Boston guy, friends with Harry Carney. And Harry Carney, one of Duke's oldest band members, from the beginning, ended up having Johnny Hodges come in the band. Duke loved him, and Johnny Hodges is the type of player that isn't just an alto player, and he didn't always play lead alto. It was, there were times where he was often just in the section, but his solos were always just these beautiful, breathing life into these melodic phrases, almost voice-like, with the smears and the vibrato. And he was one of the stars. People would go to hear the Duke Ellington band to be able to see and to hear Johnny Hodges, who played these lines that sometimes just would tug at your heartstrings emotionally. That can't be written down. You can look at notes on a page. Oh, here's Johnny Hodges, a transcription of a solo, but you can't possibly understand how an alto sax can sound like that until you hear.
Okay, who was Billy Strayhorn, Jeff?
Well, Billy Strayhorn was probably the biggest collaborator with Ellington. And there's a lot of discussion about how much Strayhorn wrote, how much Ellington wrote, how much was collaborative. Did Ellington put his name on music where he had a very small hand in? The idea here is that, as I've read, Strayhorn knew Ellington's music so well that he was actually able to, backstage in the green room, perform. I think it was maybe Sophisticated Lady, perform it exactly the way that Ellington had on stage, and then show. And if it were me, I would do it like this. And Strayhorn played it, and Ellington, that got Ellington's attention. It was like, wow, this young guy is pretty amazing. And he was classically trained. He had studied music in a traditional sense. He knew Ellington's style. He was able to work under conditions where Ellington might be calling him on the road and give him really fast, really quick deadlines. I don't know how familiar you are with Lush Life or The Background. But those are, for a young man to be writing lyrics with such depth and such harmonic interest shows, Strayhorn on his own. And that's just one of many examples. And Daydream actually is one of my favorites of his. But you tend to find his harmonic language quite advanced, and melodic language quite advanced. And I think that would have been a good inspiration to Ellington along the way. Ellington was obviously the big icon, the star. Right. A lot of the time, Strayhorn would sort of fall into the back, and I'm glad that people are paying attention to Strayhorn. And I don't know if the Hodgedu's, David Hodgedu's, if I'm saying Hodgedu correctly, but his biography on Ellington, on Strayhorn, called Lush Life is amazing. And it talks about, there were some frustrations Strayhorn had.
I was going to ask you whether they had a personal relationship. Now, Strayhorn was openly living as a gay man at that point. Is that, yes. And that back then is, really something. And Ellington obviously was this huge media star. So it must have been an interesting dynamic. Were they close personally?
They were. I mean, by all counts, and I don't know the, I don't know any precise or specific discussions about how close, but I do know that Lena Horne, who was good friends with Strayhorn, has mentioned that there was a certain chauvinistic nature to Ellington, that he would treat Strayhorn sometimes this way, and I don't have the exact quote. Strayhorn's nickname for, Ellington's nickname for Strayhorn was Sweet Pea, which says something about the relationship. It wasn't Tiger or Little Lion or something. It was the idea that I think there was a certain maybe power and authority that Ellington had. As to any closer nature of that, I haven't in my research seen or read. He seemed to be as an openly gay African American musician and artist, and he seemed to be very accepted for that. I think if anything in the band, when the band had issue, it was more a matter of just musical jealousy, and the idea is like, man, who is this guy? He plays piano and he's a composer. Duke Ellington's a piano and composer. Why is this guy always coming around? Why is he? But so I think those types of jealousies were just inherent in the nature of the competition in the band.
I guess it helps to be a genius if you're gonna, probably helps a lot. And as an outsider, I've noticed that there are the 3-minute, 4-minute songs that Ellington, Take the A Train, and I love the story about how the Take the A Train, the lyrics to Take the A Train, and the title of the song, which maybe real quickly, my understanding is that Strayhorn came to Ellington and said, I want to associate with you, and Ellington said, write a song and bring it to me, and he gave him the directions to his apartment, and Strayhorn couldn't think of a name for the song, and he took the first line of the directions, which was Take the A Train. Is that true?
That's the story, yeah.
It's a riot. But to get back to my question, I sense that there's the short pieces like Take the A Train that are 3 minutes, which I guess was a record back then, and then there were the more longer symphonic type pieces. Is that true that there was a dichotomy? Was that rare at that time? And with a 3-part question, and were the way he did it very different between the two? Or was one just longer than the other?
Yeah, that's it.
I thoroughly confused you with 3.
No, that's a great question, and it's interesting that he was dealing with, coming from the Cotton Club. He was dealing with a very, everyday set where he'd have to play, or sets where he'd have to play in a band where he's writing the short, kind of the popular numbers that you're talking about. He's also working with dancers and doing choreography and having to learn this stuff quickly. And at the same time, he's considering that within this, there is a certain restriction to what he can do, and the record length. There's a certain restriction, and Creole Rhapsody, I always sort of has as a marker for one of his first extended works, which was in 1931, I believe, just right around the time he's leaving or has left the Cotton Club. And it was 2 sides, part 1 and part 2. And the interesting part about it is you have the A side and then the B side, and it's basically a lot of playing around with the blues form, which he liked to do. And you go to the B side, and almost as to be expected on the B side of an album, you see a lot more of the sort of taking these chances. He has the trombones playing in 5-bar phrases, where in blues, we're looking at phrases of 4, so we have 8 or 12, and he has the trombones playing in 5-bar phrases. He has a little drum solo at the end. He has a trumpet break where the trumpet actually turns the beat around in the break and then comes back in, and everyone plays with these quirky little elements. And he didn't put any of the what would have been called jungle music, the growling trumpets. None of that was in this first extended work. I think this was trying to have a new association and trying to sort of extend his extend the colors on his palette without having to resort to what his band at the Cotton Club was so used to. This is just my opinion. But you can listen to that and see how as he began to evolve and shape into what you're talking about, like the popular music versus what would be like, the popular maybe dance music versus like the concert music. And there was a difference, and you see the way that he was shaping, basically looking at like song forms in the popular, and you see a lot of these as the lead sheets that would become AABA, and then you'd see stuff, for example, the Black, Brown, and Beige that he performed at Carnegie Hall in 1943, and not all critics enjoyed it, and a lot of them were very...
It's beautiful stuff.
I love it, and the idea that he was taking that chance, and maybe the band wasn't as well rehearsed because he was writing it right up to but he always did that, except this was his big concert. This was his kind of his tone poem, his tone parallel to lives of the African American, his people, and he was sharing it in a concert audience. And he took a lot of these chances, and in some cases had to learn how to do that. But I think that piece helped set him up for what he would do later on with his suites. And a lot of, I think, some of his great albums and collaborations continued with Billy Strayhorn. But I think there was a different approach. And I think a lot of that can be actually dated back to the Cotton Club. He was put in this, had these limitations placed on him. And I think he began to realize, I can do these other things, and I can do arrangements and suites. I can do arrangements of Tchaikovsky or even Rachmaninoff very early on, the C-sharp prelude, C-sharp minor prelude. But these types of ideas, I think he did approach it differently. And he was considering different audiences in the music he was writing.
Very, very interesting. There's a lot has been written about Louis Armstrong's reaction to Charlie Parker and Dizzy Gillespie and all those people. And I was reading last week that Coleman Hawkins, on the other side of the equation, always kept up and ended up being as much of a personality, very respected in the bebop community. Where did Duke fit into that when Charlie Parker and Diz and later on, I guess, Miles Davis, all those folks came along?
I think he was always aware and excited about how music was changing. And if you hear his suite to Newport, the jazz, the Newport Jazz Festival in '56, he performed this suite, and you hear very clear bebop lines in this, and you hear early on, even with Cotton Tail, very bebop ideas, using a lot of extended harmonies over the chords in the melody, having a sort of a fast up-paced tempo where you're giving a soloist a chance to actually shine as opposed to just the ensemble all of the time. The fact that he played and did an album with John Coltrane, he did an album with Coleman Hawkins. The fact that he did the Money Jungle album with Charles Mingus and Max Roach, I think shows how much he was ready to embrace a new era of jazz musicians.
And they embraced him. They didn't, because Miles Davis never had kind things to say about Louis Armstrong until he died. And then correct me if I'm wrong, Miles Davis always criticized Armstrong's public persona. And then when he died, he said, no one's ever played anything on a trumpet that Louis Armstrong didn't play first.
Right. Well, and Miles Davis criticized the Money Jungle album with Ellington, Max Roach, and Mingus too. He criticized, these guys can't play together. This is horrible. See, and so that's fun, and that's some great quotes because it can get you thinking about, what do they sound good together? Can you hear Ellington play like Ellington and Max Roach play like Max Roach and Mingus, and can you put it together and have it work? Are they listening? And so I think it's fun to consider Miles' perspectives on things, and always, and you got to love someone who has their opinions to say them and speak about it. Right.
And a thought just came into my head and went right out, unfortunately. And as soon as the interview ends, I'll remember it. But it's always the way. I wanted to ask you whether there's anything anecdotal around Duke Ellington's appearance in Anatomy of a Murder. For those people who might not be aware, Anatomy of a Murder was a movie in the mid-50s starring Jimmy Stewart, and it dealt with a rape, just a rape, not a murder, and it was very, very, very forward in its dealing with evidence, and it was very, for the 1950s, it was amazing. And by the way, the judge in the Anatomy of Murder was Joseph Walsh, who was the guy who said to McCarthy, "At long last, sir, have you no shame?" That he was the judge in the movie. But Duke Ellington was in it in a kind of nightclub that they went to, and it's very fascinating. It's a great movie. Do you know have you run into any anecdotes about that or anything?
Well, about his appearance on the set.
Yeah, and the whole thing. It's just
I have read that actually the American Bar Association considers that film, and they will use it in law schools, or have used it in law schools, talking about some of the legal process.
Right.
And this was, there was controversy, and they were saying things in a movie.
Yeah, like underwear, women's underwear. I mean, yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And the interesting part is Ellington won 3 Grammy Awards for this. Grammy Award. And there's a famous picture of him holding all of them, sort of crunched up, and he's smiling.
Right.
But the fascinating part to me is that, jazz had been always used to depict, big cities, late night, maybe this darker element, or maybe this
threatening, right?
Yeah, threatening possibly. And here we are, in Michigan is where the movie takes place.
Right.
With Jimmy Stewart, and he'll be driving down a country road, and you hear this great big bands, like jazz orchestras, sounds of rhythm and trumpets and reeds and really hip harmonic language at the time, which had even been pushing and evolving into what people would be considering like modern jazz by that time.
Right. So I told you before we started, before we actually started the interview, that my father was an attorney, and he swore by that movie. It was a great, anyone out there, I mean, check it out, both for Duke and the music and the movie itself.
And watch it, I gotta say, just watch it through to the very, very end of the credits, because you'll hear Cat Anderson play these ridiculously high screams on the trumpet at the very end of the credits. And I remember hearing that when I was younger, like, oh my gosh, Mom, what is that? Mom, what instrument is that? And I'm a trumpet player, so ending up, I can't play those notes, but Cat Anderson was very rare. But yeah, watch it through to the end. It's great.
There are people who are specialists in high register, right? There are people who just do the high stuff.
That's it. And even that, because I'm a lead trumpet player and I can't play those notes. But even with that, he was, even as a lead trumpet player, up in the highest ranks, I think.
It's like unbelievable. Jeff, just to finish off, this is the last question. Again, it's an overview kind of question. If you met someone who never heard of Duke Ellington, if that's possible, and they ask you, what would you say? Let me ask you this: what would you tell them to listen to? If that's a better question. What if 2 or 3 Duke Ellington pieces? What would you suggest to them?
Well, I think a good example for someone who doesn't know about Ellington would be to look at Mood Indigo, maybe one of his earliest hits, and a piece that he sustained in longevity through his entire career and had bands playing every night, where even if just on YouTube or looking at the elements of Mood Indigo, typing it in and seeing how much that piece has evolved. And from the very early 1930 version all the way through into the 60s, where he's playing double time tempo versions with Paul Gonzalez taking a longer, more extended solo, which was what would have been done in the 60s, but would have never been done earlier. And to hear even along the way where you begin to hear, I think it's Willie Cook on trumpet on one of the recordings where you hear him playing a solo over Mood Indigo with the bebop language, and you can hear that that's what's going on. And each arrangement has changed, and in some cases, as he was often known to do, almost like a recomposition. The form is changing, he's inserting more solos, adding an intro, adding an end. But for someone who doesn't know Ellington, I would probably give them about 3 or 4 different versions of the same piece to listen to so they can understand how Ellington evolved and changed, and he wasn't just stuck in 1930 or stuck in his Cotton Club, but he was always looking, looking into other sources and always changing and adapting.
Mm-hmm. Jeff, I'd like to thank you very much. Again, we've been talking about Duke Ellington and some other things as well with Jeff Claassen. Jeff is an associate professor of harmony at the Berklee College of Music in Boston. And Jeff, I'd like to just thank you very, very much. It's been an absolute pleasure.
Thanks so much, Carl. This was a pleasure. Thank you for having me today.
Thank you.